Hi, and welcome to a special feel-good episode of InstDivision. That's right, they call economics the dismal science, but maybe it has some lessons to teach us that aren't so dismal. We're joined today by Russ Roberts. He's the John and Jean Denault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He hosts the weekly Econ Talk podcast, and he's the co-creator of the internet sensation Keynes Hayek rap videos. You gotta watch those, they're awesome. His new book is How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, an unexpected guide to human nature and happiness. Welcome.
Good to be with you.
So Adam Smith was an economist, and economists, as everybody knows, are dry and boring. What can an economist tell us about human nature and happiness?
Well, economists in the modern era have a very dry and flat view of humanity. Generally, economists assume that people try to maximize what we call utility, which is a vague term that has something to do with happiness. And we do that by taking stuff, buying stuff, experiencing stuff, services, etc. It's a very mechanical view of people that sees them as sort of happiness machines. You put in a bunch of stuff, goods, services, experiences, and out comes happiness, utility, satisfaction. And Smith had a much richer view of the human enterprise. In particular, he emphasized that what we really care about is being admired, respected, honored, paid attention to. That's what gives the real satisfaction in life. It's not stuff. It's what people think of us and the reputation that we have. And he says, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. We want to be loved, meaning not just physically, romantically loved, but admired, respected, honored, praised. And we want to be lovely. We want to earn honor, be praiseworthy, be worthy of admiration. And that was Smith's view of our frailty and our reality as human beings. And that's a much richer idea of what we really care about. And it's a nice idea, and I think he's right.
Every few years, somebody rediscovers Smith's theory of moral sentiments. But you're not some Johnny-come-lately. Why doesn't he get more attention?
Well, it's a tough book to read, for starters. It was written, the first edition was 1759. Smith has a very charming but slightly archaic writing style that isn't easily accessible to a modern reader. The book's not terribly well organized. It's a little hard to follow. It starts sort of in midstream. And it took me a while to get into it myself. And there are people who still read it. They're mainly philosophers interested in moral philosophy, which is what the book is on the surface about. But it's really, in many ways, the greatest self-help book you've never read. And Smith has all kinds of advice on how to deal with celebrity, technology, our family, our colleagues at work, and all the things that really make us tick and what gives life its real meaning. So it's a book that's definitely worth reading, but for the modern reader, it's a little challenging. So what I try to do in my book is to give people a guide on how to read it. And I'd be thrilled if people go back and read the original. There's wonderful versions online at the Library of Economics and Liberty that you can access without any charge. But if you find that going a little bit slow, you can read my book, which is more of a commentary.
Losing a little finger means more to a person than an earthquake in China does. Is this good or bad?
So Smith gives this example. It's really quite extraordinary. He says, if you hear the news that there's been an earthquake in China and millions of people are dead, you'll be very sad for a minute. You might give to some charity to help people who may have survived or their families. You're going to express concern to a colleague who tells you about it. But you'll sleep pretty well that night. You'll pretty much put it out of your mind, which I think is, for better or for worse, the way we actually are. He says, but if you knew that you're going to lose your little finger the next day in an operation, you're going to toss and turn, and you're not going to be able to sleep very well. And I think he's right, but he doesn't stop there. And I think most people stop there and say, oh, Smith's got this terrible attitude toward human beings. But Smith says, if you feel that way, if your emotional reaction to your little finger is bigger than your emotional reaction to millions of people killed in faraway country. But if someone said to you, hey, you can save your little finger, all you have to do is kill these Chinese people, he said you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't think of it for a second. He said no one would be so monstrous. And so he's interested in the question, why is it that emotionally we care more about ourselves, but we still often will not put ourselves first. We'll put others in front of us. We'll sacrifice for other people, and we won't put ourselves first. And his argument is quite interesting. It isn't that, oh, we're basically good at heart, because he's already reminded us that we do have a stronger emotional reaction to losing the little finger than the deaths of those Chinese. He says the reason we wouldn't make that trade, the reason we wouldn't kill people to save our little finger is that we know that the reaction of people would be so negative to that self-centeredness. He said, so we're basically self-centered, we're self-interested, but we know that if we act that way all the time, no one's going to respect us. And he says, deep down, what we really want is the respect of other people. So even though we see ourselves as the center of our universe, if we act that way, we're not going to get very far in society. So he understood this really profound idea. He says, it's not your religious background or your parents giving you your conscience. Your conscience comes from you imagining someone watching you. He calls him the impartial spectator who judges you, who doesn't have a stake in the matter, who's outside without any skin in the game, who looks at you and says, well, gee, that's nasty, or, oh, that was really admirable. And that's what Smith says motivates us to be good people.
You say, when we earn the admiration of others honestly by being respectable, honorable, blameless, generous, and kind, the end result is true happiness. That sounds awesome. So why don't more people try that?
Well, he understood that we were very tempted by other ways of being respected than just being good. He says there are really two ways to get people to pay attention to you. One way, which is the way a lot of people are tempted to and actually do follow, is to accumulate a lot of money or a lot of fame or a lot of power. And he says if you do that, if you're wealthy, rich, or famous, you're wealthy, famous, or powerful, you're going to have a lot of people paying attention to you. They're going to hang on your every word. They're going to interview you when you walk into a room. All the eyes of the people are going to be upon you. He says that's really not the right way to go. And he says the right way to go is to be wise and virtuous. He said you won't get as much acclaim, but it'll be better earned. He said if you follow that first path, the wealth, fame, and power thing, he said, you're really going to do a bunch of things you're going to regret later. And then once you've achieved it, you're not really any happier than you were before. He says you're going to end up being kind of addicted to those things. You're going to want people to fawn over you and pay attention to you. And we see this with athletes and celebrities, movie stars, rock stars. Very hard for them to return to normal life. They have tons of money, but they're not so happy all the time. And Smith understood that.
A civilized society is about more than laws. How does that work?
So Smith has this really extraordinary vision of where culture, civility, and civilization itself comes from. He basically says, he calls God the author of nature. He says the author of nature put inside us this desire to receive approval and to avoid disapproval from the people around us. So when we're interacting with people on a daily basis, our friends, our family, our colleagues at work, he says we're constantly responding to their emotional actions, their decisions. And he says, God appointed us as the judge of mankind. We, each of us, by responding to what people do, we create incentives and signals as to what's good and bad behavior. So if, for example, somebody does something nice, you'll smile, you might compliment that person, you might want to be around them more. And someone does something dishonorable, you might raise an eyebrow, you might decide to shun them, not be friends with them anymore. And he says this subtle interplay of all the interactions we have with the people around us fundamentally creates the norms of civilization that we take for granted and that we get to enjoy, and allows us to make decisions and to interact with each other without worrying constantly about being taken advantage of or exploited. And we don't appreciate that. We look around us, we see we live basically in a good society. I give the example in my book of going to Big Sur, California to stay at a remote cabin with my wife. We have a wonderful night planned. But the landlord, the owner of the cabin, I can't get her the check in time. So she says, oh, don't worry about it. Just come to the cabin, put the money when you leave the next morning. I'll leave it unlocked for you. Leave the money on the table. My cleaning lady will take the money and she'll bring it to me. And I thought, this is kind of a recipe for disaster. The cleaning lady could keep the money. I could not put it down. She could pretend the landlord could pretend she never got it. But it all worked out great. And it's a wonderful thing that we have that level of trust, which is not always, of course, there. But when it is there, it's a wonderful thing because it lets us enjoy and exchange and be around people without having to always worry about being taken advantage of. And when you live in that society, you can make all kinds of decisions and enjoy all kinds of things you can't otherwise. In a different kind of culture, everybody's always looking out for themselves, trying to get an edge, trying to take advantage of people. It's like a memo goes out in our culture, says, yeah, basically most people are pretty good. You can trust them. In other cultures, it's be careful. Everybody's out to take advantage of you. If you live in that first society, which is basically the United States in many settings, it's a much more pleasant place. And then you have to ask, well, who sent the memo? Where did it come from? Who said it's okay to be trustworthy and that most people earn that trust and are trustworthy? Instead of saying, well, that kind of comes from the stew of our interactions together. We create it, not consciously, but through our honoring of good behavior and dishonoring of bad behavior, we create the incentives that allow civilization to flourish.
Adam Smith didn't think we were saints, but he thought we were better than modern economic models suggest. Why?
Yeah, I think he saw us as we truly are, flawed, imperfect, complicated, prone to self-deception. So many people call Smith the first behavioral economist. And I like Smith's richer view of humanity that puts more of a focus on these deep things that give us meaning in life rather than the superficial. Now, you can't blame modern economics. It, of course, often is trying to explain why people buy certain things. And so it tends to focus on the material, the physical stuff. But what makes Smith so great is that he's really has a broad view of human nature and of the whole enterprise of social science. He's not just looking at financial or commercial behavior. He had a lot to say about it in his more famous book, The Wealth of Nations. But in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he's really looking at the micro interactions we have with the people around us.
Where can people go to find out more?
You can go to my website, RUSSROBERTS.INFO. You can read reviews of it at Amazon.com and buy it there if you're interested in it. And of course, as I said, you can read The Theory of Moral Sentiments online. I also did a 6-part podcast with Dan Klein on the Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, at econtalk.org, my podcast website.
Thanks so much for taking the time to join us, Russ.
You bet.
And that's all for this episode. We hope you found unexpected happiness here. The book is by Russell Roberts, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, an unexpected guide to human nature and happiness. We'll be back in the future. In the meantime, have fun on the internet and stay happy.